begin speaking. So welcome everyone. I have the pleasure to host and moderate this colloquium today. My name is Maren Hachmeister. I am an academic researcher here at the Institute. And I have the pleasure to introduce to you today's speakers and to moderate the discussion here. On the list of participants for today, we have a lot more people than are here yet. So please don't feel unsettled if people maybe last minute enter the room or enter the Zoom room. We have still people popping into the Zoom room, so we have a hybrid meeting. Be prepared that we're going to switch attention to both groups. And yeah, welcome to our students. This is not only a colloquium, not only an academic talk, but we have an exercise at the TU Dresden with our students joining. So there's going to be a lot of participation from our students also. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce the two speakers. Today's speakers are two dear colleagues from Prague, who we know from the Partner Institute, the Institute of Contemporary History in Prague, who co-organize the colloquium together with us. And the first, so it's Matěj Spurný and Petr Roubal. And Matěj Spurný is a researcher in contemporary and social history. He's also interested in urban and environmental history of post-war Czechoslovakia. He works both as an associate professor at Charles University in Prague and as a senior researcher at the Institute for Contemporary History. Those of you who have an interest in Czech or Czechoslovak history in the 20th century have most probably come across his publications. He publishes in Czech, English, and German, and he has published several monographs. I have not the time to mention all of his publications, but I would like to mention one which is maybe most interesting also for today's talk, and that's Making the Most of Tomorrow. And maybe you have read this yet. If not, I highly recommend. I'm not mispronouncing. It's Making the Most of Tomorrow. It's a play of words. It can also be Making the Most of Tomorrow, and Most is a city in northern Bohemia. So this is one book, I think, in which he very well develops ideas of nationality and communism in post-war Czechoslovakia. And so some of his research interests also cover technocracy, environmental devastation, and crisis of organized modernity in socialist Czechoslovakia. And I think most of you might already know him. So I will continue with our next speaker, Petr Roubal. Petr Roubal is also a researcher at the Institute of Contemporary History of the Czech Academy of Sciences. I think by training he is not only a historian but also an anthropologist. And I must say, I find super curious about your CV that you have this very special and peculiar interest in urban planning, which I find unusual, and I'm super curious to hear more about that. Of course, he's also an established researcher. He has published several books and articles. Maybe you have come across his book on the Spartakiads, Politics of Physical Culture in Communist Czechoslovakia. This is a book where he demonstrates his interest in social and cultural history of state socialism and post-socialism. And currently, he is mostly working on the urban history of socialist and post-socialist cities. And as I said before, in that he has a particular interest in urban planning, or the lack of urban planning. And I think we might hear more about that in a minute, because our two speakers, Matěj Spurný and Petr Roubal, they're going to talk today about urban transformations. The title of their talk is Post-socialist Urban Transformations in East Central Europe, the Cases of Prague and Bratislava. We're going to share maybe their presentation. Can you share their presentation? You're trying. Okay. Just stop screen sharing and try again. Yeah. And if it's not working with the presentation directly, you might share the entire desktop and then click to the presentation if necessary. Of course, this is happening. You know, never trust your system. We've checked this twice before. Yeah. Just give us a second. Yeah, it's working. It's working now. I just have to go to the full screen. That's it. So again, the title of today's talk is Post-socialist Urban Transformations in East Central Europe, cases of Prague and Bratislava, and as I see Matěj Spurný is going to begin. Enjoy.
Yeah, schönen guten Morgen. Thank you very much for this great introduction. I'm really glad, or we are both really glad that we can, not only that we can be here, that we can speak here today, but also that this whole series actually is taking place, because that's a great collaboration between our two institutes, which I hope will have some follow-up, and thank you to everybody who is active in this collaboration. What we want to do today, what we want to say is actually it is connected to our common project, to our research, which is now heading the end, which was called In Search of Postmodern City, Prague and Bratislava between 1970 and 2000. So we are now in third year of this research, but both of us actually also did quite a lot of work to these topics before this project started. So this is somehow also included. And I would now like to say a couple of words to what was this project about, to sort of our what we actually wanted to know about the transformation of Czech and Slovak capitals, about Prague and Bratislava, and then I say a couple of words about sort of how we did proceed and what came out of it, what was surprising, and then we moved to several topics, issues of these urban transformations of both of these cities, to actually three topics where we try to say a bit more in depth about what came out, and we will sort of change, and so it will be a sort of a duet of the two of us. Yes. Well, the point of departure of our project 3 years ago was obviously the ambition to contribute to understanding the roots of the current crisis of major cities in our region, not only Prague and Bratislava, of course, sustaining in traffic overload, deteriorating environment, debt, and especially housing crisis. And of course, this crisis is often related to some global issues, such as the multinational capital and so on. But we wanted to go more into that, into the historical roots of this crisis, as social and urban historians, also art historians and historians of architecture. We have it's the project. It's not only the two of us. It's we have two other colleagues in Prague, and two great colleagues in Bratislava as senior researchers also, and they are Henrietta Moravčíková and Petr, who are actually, as they say, not orthodox historians, but they are historians, they are architects and art historians, and their perspective is in some points different one. So it's not only Czech-Slovak project, but it's also a sort of interdisciplinary project. So this group of people, we somehow shared the assumption that what happened with our cities after 1989 had roots in the last decade or even decades of state socialism, and that we have to study this development of the 90s in a broader historical context, what you call in German lange Wende. So that was also our assumption. And the existing research of urban sociology and urban geography gave us an important input concerning especially the analysis of neoliberalization of urban policies and its result in spatial and social changes in the 1990s and later. But what we were missing to a great part in the existing research and what we wanted to offer was the historical observation of the cases of individual cities and also districts and societal groups in the transformation. So we were interested in actually changing of discourses, so the crisis of modernist planning and the sort of emergence of postmodern understanding of the city. Then also in the policies and in the role of experts in these policies and in urban plans. And last but not least, also in the practice of urban construction and urban life. And the main challenge, of course, talking especially about the 1990s, about the post-1989 period, was the sort of when we wanted to successfully fill this gap, which we sort of identified to historicize the process of transformation of urban space in both capitals. The main challenge was the availability actually of primary sources, because the situation of researching the 90s is basically different from researching about the socialist period concerning sources, primary sources. So that was sort of a big question mark. And what we found, so that was sort of our aim, our point of departure, and what we found partly confirmed our assumptions concerning especially this question of deep roots of the post-1989 changes and of the long continuities. But in many fields, we actually were also quite surprised. Sort of the example of the development of the two cities shows that if you really historicize the transformation, the resulting picture then in many ways does not correspond to the common narrative about the invasion of neoliberalism and hostile takeover of urban space and urban policies by transnational capital, or gradually establishing domestic investors. So I know. Yeah. No. Okay. So these are some preliminary findings which I can just say a bit about, and then we will follow with the first topic more in detail. So concerning the sources, that was actually a good surprise for us, or not completely surprised, because we tried to we did something before on that topic also, but there are actually more than enough primary sources also for concerning the 1990s, at least in the Czech and Slovak environment. There are quite nice possibilities to research in city archives and also city district archives about actually especially the policies and about the daily politics of this time, especially the first half of the 90s. In the second half of the 90s, it may sometimes be not everything available, but still we were sort of. That was not the problem. We were a bit afraid about that, but we really had more than we were capable to read, and from both cities. And of course, we also have other sources. We spoke with a lot of contemporaries, architects, politicians of like municipal politicians of 1990s and so on. So there is a lot of sources which we were able to work with. And there is even much more which is there, but we are not capable to sort of read and hear everything what we wanted in these 3 years. The second point, actually, the economy matters. Of course, this is not surprise, speaking about capitalism in the 1990s, but what we found, and this is somehow connected with the third point, the stagnation of both cities in 1990s in terms of construction and urban development. But actually, even when you take the title of our project, In Search of Postmodern City, it concentrates more on the urban space and architecture, let's say. And when we look at the 1990s in Prague and Bratislava, we found that actually not that much was built. So it's not that much about aesthetics. It's maybe less about aesthetics in the end. So speaking about our outcome or about our planned book, because actually what the main sort of in the center of interest of municipal policies was the process of privatization, of restitution, and all these sort of economic structural changes that actually took much of energy of the 1990s political strategies and sort of restructuring the governance in the cities and concerning actually the city development and construction. That was one of the weakest decade in contemporary history in both cities, but where actually not that much was built. And then sort of the residents of the city. That's also interesting how actually many actors there are and how active they are, how actively they are dealing with this whole process, and how much power also the sort of citizens have in shaping the policies of the 1990s. So that's one of the outcome which we will discuss also later, how actually this interaction between experts, politicians and the many, the so-called ordinary people. And last point, yes, this is also important. What we found out, that the differences of both cities, especially after 1989, are much more pronounced than we actually expected. We expected maybe more common story, which with some specific issues in both cities, but still, I think the outcome will be there is a common framework of the crisis of modernist urban development, of crisis of communist rule and neoliberalization and sort of capitalist development in the 1990s, but many sort of other chapters of this development are quite different in both cities, which also poses interesting questions. So some of these findings will be then discussed in more detail in the context of our selected topics about which we want to talk about later, and we will try to get back to them in our conclusions also. But now I will give the word to Petr, and we will dive into the first topic we want to talk more in detail.
Thank you very much, Matěj, and I will stop. I will set my clock watch. We really have time for discussion, so I'll try to discuss a huge topic in 8 minutes or so we'll see. Most of the research on the post-socialist cities focuses on what's specific about socialist city, and that is the panel housing estates. And I wanted to look at something which seemingly didn't change that much, and that is the inner cities, which are sort of Belle Epoque housing stocks. So that's what I will be talking about, and how the sort of heritage protection aspect of that changed and played a role in transformation. But before that. We are not only duo, but I think we are also sort of engaged in a polemic. So I notice your sort of lack of enthusiasm for aesthetics. I think that I need to talk about at the beginning. I think it's all about aesthetics for me. I think there is strange neoliberal aesthetics in play, and that is something that I think I will be speaking about, in fact. Yeah, but aesthetics on a bit higher level, not instance. You're absolutely right that surprisingly very little was built in comparison with what was achieved before. The 90s are really very poor, but the aesthetics, I think, are resting exactly in these sort of instincts of preserving architecture of this inner city housing. It's an example. There are many other aspects of this neoliberal aesthetics, yeah? But one of them is that suddenly the aesthetics of the Belle Epoque, basically historicist styles, actually highly monotonous, unoriginal, deeply sort of criticized by modernist architects, quite rightly so, for covering up the deep social inequalities that were hidden in the houses. Yeah? So you had these fancy facades, but behind that you had really horrible living conditions. And this sort of contrast was what really irritated the modernists. And suddenly, of course, in this postmodern neoliberal aesthetics, this is actually the cool quarters that needs to be preserved, while those sort of quite efficient housing on the suburbs are deemed to be terribly ugly, and therefore this time to be torn down. So I sort of, based on my older work on transformation of Žižkov Quarter in Prague, which was a symbol of redevelopment plans, and it was the most sort of striking example in the whole of Czechoslovakia, and it was perceived as such by the actors themselves. One of the chief architects who planned the redevelopment of these quarters said Žižkov became a symbol, yeah, for the whole process and also testing ground. Yeah? So they knew that it would be very difficult and complex to do something like that, so they tried to do that on this Prague quarter, and then they hope to replicate that elsewhere. Another architect who actually was against that plan said, I don't care about Žižkov, I want to destroy the system, when he went against these plans. Yeah? So for the other side, it also was a symbol. He said that publicly, risking his career and probably more. On the other hand, he was drunk when he said that, so that's probably sort of balances out. For the political opposition, it also was a symbol. Yeah, so there were public protests organized by the opposition. There were some sort of, it was used, instrumentalized by the opposition. Now, originally, this quarter was supposed to be completely destroyed, and sort of solitary panel houses surrounded by the greenery were supposed to be built there, and this was supposed to be the fate of all the inner city quarters in Prague. Yeah? These were the plans from the late 50s and 60s. But then in the 70s, sort of three things happened in terms of these original plans. First is that the heritage protection idea sort of broadened. And first, it was that the inner core, historical, which was always protected in this sort of Czechoslovak heritage discourse, yeah, the old town, new town, lesser quarter, these were sort of untouchable, yeah, in principle. But now what was preserved was also sort of the broader framework of that core, and that in practical sense, sort of the view from the Prague castle towards these sort of historical quarters should not be disturbed what's behind that. Yeah, so it was not about these quarters, but it was about the view of this of the historical core. So that means that the panel houses that were built on the destroyed part of Žižkov had to sort of conform to these aesthetic ideas. Yeah, that's what you see on the first picture on the left. The housing that they built there was sort of modified. It doesn't look that much here, but for example, the typical eyesore of the engine rooms on the top of the housing estates is not here, and it was a very complex fashion moved downstairs. The energy crisis contributed to that shift as well. There is a clear focus on the inner city development rather than the peripheral housing estates. And finally, a recognition of the human scale of the traditional quarters that are sort of contributing to more lively living space. Yeah, that was already sort of recognized already in the cities. But all these things, in fact, led the planning bureaus to focus on inner cities. Yeah? That actually led to the physical destruction of the quarter, which in Žižkov happened in sort of 1/3 roughly, and the rest was only in plan. And then huge amounts sort of protest emerged that challenged the established plans and led to sort of the perception of genius loci as being sort of a combination of heritage concerns for this art historicists and Art Nouveau architecture on one side, but combined with sort of a preservation of social fabric, as well as some sort of economic and environmental concerns. Yeah? So it was sort of a whole package of concerns that the protest voices sort of raised, and they were very vocal in that. Okay, so this is the destruction of part of the Žižkov quarter. These were some of the sort of plans that try to preserve the social fabric of the quarter. Yeah? So by moving the inhabitants inside of the quarter rather than moving them outside of the quarter entirely. I think I will have to skip that part altogether. That's my other sort of project, and I have a sort of online exhibition that you can check. We don't have time for that now. This really became sort of a major scandal in Prague, one of the 2-3 cases that really created a great sort of distrust in the urban planning. And this is one of the examples of sort of the public attempt at ridiculing and criticizing the plans. But to get straight to what's our today topic, that is what happened in the transformation period. In a nutshell, all these architects who protested against the redevelopment plans sort of saw a great victory in 1989, which actually meant that all these plans were stopped. Yeah? They were already in troubles before, but now they were stopped. All these inner city quarters were declared heritage zones, so no such plans ever will be possible in this space. But at the same time, it was sort of a bitter victory because what they witnessed was that the heritage side was fulfilled, while the social concerns that they had was not. Yeah? So these quarters were gentrified, and all the people that many people that they tried to protect from being moved to the panel houses on the outskirts were actually eventually moved to panel houses, but actually not on Prague outskirts, but rather to the sort of socially deprived parts of Bohemia that basically is the Sudetenland. Yeah? So this sort of transformation is something that I deal with and try to look how it's possible to embed the heritage side from the broader framework of the genius loci that those architects try to envision for the future. But I think I'll stop here.
Okay, so I will now talk about the issue of housing and especially housing privatization in the 1990s. And I mean, here as well, the point of departure is the perception of crisis of the urban milieu, including housing in major cities in late socialism. And I would say this crisis had in the 1980s two layers. The first one is connected with the issues already addressed by Petr, sort of broadly shared ideas of home, which somehow shifted emphasis of the citizens from modern comforts to, let's say, place, memory, and coziness. This reinforced the criticism of the form of mass-produced prefabricated housing, housing estates, and of neglecting the historical parts of the city. So that the main principles of housing construction and modernization in the 1980s no longer corresponded to perceived values and new forms of relationship to the environment. So that also the mass housing estates seemed to have no future. That was one context also of housing in late socialism, which is important, but I would focus on the second aspect of what was perceived as a crisis phenomenon, and that is the dysfunctional housing market, which is connected to the strategies of acquisition and maintenance of apartments in state socialist conditions, because we are convinced, based on our research, that this second issue, is actually crucial to explain the huge support for housing privatization in the 1990s in Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, but also in other post-socialist countries, actually. Of course, in the context of late socialist Czechoslovakia, the apartment represented a form of capital, but it operated in a distinct manner from its role in capitalist economy, where it would typically function as a commodity. Acquisition of housing, dominantly a status of a tenant in state-owned flat, was typically achieved through employment or founding the family, with the ideal scenario being a combination of both. However, the waiting periods were lengthy, particularly in major urban centers such as Prague and Bratislava, often spanning several years. I have a nice quotation here on that topic, which somehow illustrates it. In this context, a variety of privileges were at play, including political, social, and financial factors. So the strategy of most families in such an environment was to retain rights to the apartments in which family members resided. A common scenario involved the fictitious relocation of a grandchild to their grandmother's residence, so that it later gains or de facto inherits the rental contract after grandmother's death or her move to a retirement home. And in the event that the family's circumstances had changed and the family needed to require a different apartment, it was nearly impossible to navigate such transactions through the relevant authorities. And that was why an informal market for apartments emerged, comprising significant additional payments for apartments of superior category or size. The care for flats provided by the state was also quite insufficient. And also in this case, tenants had to wait very long for repairs to be completed. Consequently, and also because the assumption was that the apartment would stay in the family for a long time or for generations, individuals generally did not hesitate to undertake and finance even major repairs or costly reconstructions themselves in the 1970s and 80s. So with other words, although they were legally tenants, people treated the apartments as if they were their own property, trading in them, investing in them, and attempting to retain them for generations. And in this context, we can speak about a form of informal inheritance rights, a quasi-ownership of flats or houses. And this special relationship between people and state-owned or cooperative flats combined a subjectively perceived right to an apartment with the absence of a legal guarantee to this right. And this played, as I see it, a pivotal role in the demand for housing privatization after the Velvet Revolution. I will show that later, not to disturb you now. So after 89, this sort of first issue I was talking about, or also Petr was talking about, the arrogance of the technocratic approach to the city this was of course pivotal to the critical debate of the 1980s and became a significant factor in the anti-regime protests. And after 1990, we can trace attempts to humanize housing estates. A lot of environmental issues also were solved by industry closures, especially. But by time, in the early 90s, the discourse of humanization of the urban space was overshadowed by the issue of property and housing market. Since 1993, it shaped really the dynamics of both cities and finally led to a transformation of housing from a public good into a private asset in the hands of individual owners in an extent that can be seen as extreme compared to many other European metropolis. And there are several reasons of this shift, as we see it. Both cities, first actually, is that both cities became the proprietors of considerable quantity of real estate. The municipalities lacked the financial resources to repair such a number of buildings. And housing stock constituted a significant financial burden for cities in the 1990s, particularly given the minimal income generated from it, because rents were subject to a very sharp regulation and were unable to cover the basic maintenance of the housing stock, let alone the extensive repairs that were required. So privatization of housing somehow, at least to some extent, seemed inevitable. But even in this situation, city councils in both cities didn't push for housing privatization in a radical way that eventually later came to fruition. Both in Prague and in Bratislava, the vision of a mixed ownership structure of housing with 20 to 40% of public housing was dominant until at least the half of the 1990s. Here you see some of the numbers. So of course, flats in ownership of municipality in the beginning of the 90s was very, very high, and even the rest was mostly cooperative housing. And then you see the sort of program of both municipal councils still in 1993 and even 1996. There was sort of the vision of somehow mixed ownership, but in the end, after 2010, these are the last numbers, really low ownership of the municipalities. This is the some here you see that some numbers to both cities, some contemporary numbers, but maybe this one is better. So this is, I mean, as we can observe here also, many. The question is what factors contributed to this divergence between articulated goals and outcomes of housing policies. Many tenants in municipality-owned flats articulated demand for buying apartments already before the privatization process started in 1992 or 93, which was sort of the second important reason next to the I was talking about before. And tenants usually called for rapid privatization of apartments with convincing arguments. Neglected houses and flats needed investments, but their tenants didn't have enough capital. And the status of owners would, in contrast to the mere status of tenants, open the possibility of loans for the people. Moreover, ownership rights seemed to be the only legal security in the wild waters of transformation. From the systematic privatization of housing, participants also promised themselves escape from the sort of chaos of waiting lists, patronage, and bribery associated with the acquisition of rental apartments in state socialism, and still present in the first half of the 1990s. And this perspective was gradually accepted by the majority of city district councils, so that many city districts in both cities put pressure on the city council and indirectly government in order to develop and enact appropriate legislation to enable privatization of housing. So with other words, ordinary people and their local representatives were immensely active in this process of accelerating the privatization. And how did this look in practice? I call it the sell-off, Ausverkauf of the cities. Well, the laws on the transfer and sale of flats, which were still being worked on within Czechoslovakia, but finalized and approved in 93, 94 separately already within Czech Republic and Slovakia, allowed municipalities to transfer flats to individual owners, but did not force them to do so. So this was sort of the decision of the municipalities in the end. The legal structure of housing privatization was slightly different in both cities, but that's maybe not that important. These differences, we can talk about it later if you are interested. But what was common were the sort of main aspects of and phases of the private housing privatization. The first one, actually both cities decided to follow the path of preferential transfers of flats to existing tenants. That's the main sort of principle of the system. So the existing tenants had the right to buy the flats they occupied on favorable terms for a sum of money corresponding to roughly 10 times average monthly salary at the time. So in today's term, a packet. And the free sale of flats for significantly higher sums of money was possible only in cases where the existing tenants did not express interest. Then second important note that some 50 to 70% flats in both cities have still been owned by the city in the early 90s, as you have seen. And the management of the vast majority of these flats was transferred by the cities to the municipal districts already in the beginning of the 90s. And these particular city districts subsequently controlled the whole process of housing privatization, so that the city councils, of the whole city, whole Prague or Bratislava, had relatively difficult and delayed access to information about the process, and in practice had few tools to influence the process in the individual districts. which became important. And the issue, third point, the issue of housing privatization, especially in the second half of the 1990s, completely dominated the agenda of the district councils, so that the selling of flats and houses was dealt with at every meeting of the district councils, often the most of the duration of the meeting, and other housing related issues, especially housing construction, took really a backseat. So that between 1994 and 97, some marginal exceptions, no housing was built. And these particular districts regulated the privatization of flats by their own ordinances, which in many cases de facto established the right of existing tenants to buy their flats. So selling of apartments as quickly as possible was considered as a success, and the various districts competed informally in this discipline. How much of their housing stock they managed already to privatize, and this was a sort of a spiral of housing privatization, and which was almost impossible to stop in practice. City councils had no legal treatment of the conditions and means to stop the ongoing privatization, and so it happened that actually at some point after 2000, the share of flats in municipal property in both cities fell far below the original intended tens of percentages. And then what I didn't talk about, and we can maybe talk in discussion, was the process of restitution of flats, which was another sort of a bit inorganic element in this whole system. So this is now for me, and I will come back in our conclusions back to some of these issues again. But now
thank you, Matěj. We seem to be running out of time, so I will be really quick. I just wanted to give the basic. I go back, sorry. I just want to bring back the issue of heritage, but in different sense, as a heritage in a sense of what broader inheritance of the socialist city. Yeah, that sort of to take the term heritage in Czech dědictví literally as something that we got as sort of a gift. Yeah? We as sort of new neoliberal agents in running of the cities. This is something that I was inspired by social geographer Oleg Golubčíkov to think about, who says rather than a barrier to capital or neoliberalization, the spatial legacy of state socialism should be reimagined as the very infrastructure of neoliberalization, within which neoliberal capitalism becomes embedded and which it uses for accumulation. Yeah, so what is the opposite of that idea? The opposite of the idea is what is usually thought about the socialist urban heritage, and that is sort of burden that the new administration, the inhabitants of the post-communist city are sort of dealing with, and they are gradually sort of getting rid of. It's sort of a mortgage that you pay off, and as you move temporarily away from the socialist city, that sort of burden of the past is decreasing. Yeah? And this idea is quite sort of opposite, or at least tries to treat the heritage as more as sort of something dynamic. Yeah? That it is a dynamic interplay between what's inherited from the socialist era and the new actors. I can give you a few examples. For example, there is a sort of functional concentration under socialism in the cities. Yeah? So the city centers are centers of investment, so that the socialist cities do invest more in the city centers than elsewhere, but for sort of functional reasons. Yeah? The transportation system is directed to sort of efficient distribution of the resources there in the center. And then, but it's in the context of sort of national plan, and so it makes sense in the sort of overall planning. And then the regime collapses, and suddenly this sort of functional concentration plays in the hand of sort of real estate developers who suddenly get terribly important and sort of a set of opportunities to generate profit in those functional concentration without being tied to all the sort of social and economic obligations that they were under socialism. And there are so many other examples where sort of what these new economic agents got in the transition is not sort of some sort of burden, but in fact sort of a gift that they could work with. But I think we can develop that further in the discussion. Let's give.
I will be very brief with the conclusions.
Yeah, good.
Perfect. That we have time for discussion. I mean, I will maybe show our conclusions. This is more to sum up what we actually have been talking about. Maybe, well, the sort of one grand idea is the idea of continuities next, sort of besides the rupture of 89, of course, and concerning the housing policies, what I was trying to show was, on one hand, the discursive continuity in trust in the beneficial implications of living in one's own home, which was already there in late socialism, sort of late socialist individualism, but what is there maybe even more, what was for us also even more surprising was actually the outcome that this continuity is also a continuity of the capital of the individual actors, because flats were mainly privatized by their tenants, and those who were in nice parts of the cities in the 80s actually gained these flats for not for free but for very little money. So there is a sort of exchange of the former cultural, social, and political capital in the 70s and 80s for economical capital in form of ownership of exclusive housing stock, and surprising continuity in below this sort of rupture of housing ownership, at least in the 90s. Of course, the question is what happens after that. So on one hand, it was in the end a deeply neoliberal state of affairs, or it is, of relatively weak municipalities and extremely high share of private housing ownership, talking about housing, but at the same time, ordinary people, the tenants actually who became the owners, they are not passive victims of some neoliberal process. They are those who really actively took part in it, and many also profited. So that's sort of not sort of interesting contradictions of the process. And also, I think in the questions of heritage, as Petr showed, in both sort of in the narrow sense, it's you have a lot of well, the story can be told in many ways, at least. And what is particularly interesting is this contradiction between secured heritage protection in the narrow sense for historical architecture, but at the same time gentrification and displacement or ethnic segregation, which took part, which was actually not the original idea of those who tried to protect it, these districts. And then also, of course, if you think in a more broader sense, then the whole question of heritage becomes even more complicated, because it's not only the classical historical heritage, but it's everything that the cities inherited from socialism. And then in thinking in especially economic terms, it becomes not a mortgage or burden of the past, but actually accumulated value that the new neoliberal actors inherited without the constraints of the state socialist social or economic order. Yeah, that's what we wanted to say, and now we have time for discussion. Thank you very much.